When a wealthy socialite tries to kick Shaq off his own golf course, she unknowingly starts a battle that will shake the elite to its core. As the truth comes out, secrets unravel, and power shifts in ways no one saw coming. But the real question isn't who owns Oakhaven. It's whether the old elite can survive what happens next. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun was high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the rolling greens of Oakhaven Golf Club. The perfectly manicured fairways stretched endlessly, an oasis of wealth and exclusivity tucked away in one of the most prestigious corners of the state. For decades, Oakhaven had been a haven for old money elites, a place where power and privilege thrived behind polite smiles and unspoken rules. The club prided itself on tradition, its long history, its carefully curated membership, and most importantly, its ability to keep certain people out. But today, that tradition was about to be challenged. Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq, had arrived. Dressed in a crisp polo shirt, relaxed fit khakis, and a simple cap, Shaq stepped out of his black Escalade and took in the scene. He was here for one reason only: to enjoy a quiet day on the course. Golf had become a passion of his over the years, a break from the noise of the world, a place where he could slow down and clear his mind. He had played on some of the finest courses across the country, but Oakhaven was different. Because now, he owned it. It was a decision he had made privately, acquiring the club through an investment group, letting the transition happen quietly. He hadn't made a grand announcement, hadn't flaunted his ownership. He wanted to see how things operated firsthand, how people truly behaved when they didn't know who was watching. As he made his way toward the clubhouse, a few heads turned. Some recognized him immediately, whispering among themselves. Others simply saw a tall, unfamiliar man and dismissed him. The staff at the front desk greeted him with professional courtesy, offering a reserved nod as he checked in for his tea time. And then there was Celeste Montclair. She spotted him the moment he stepped onto the course, and her expression immediately hardened. Celeste was in her early 50s, her hair a shade too blonde to be natural, styled in a perfect bob. She wore a white designer golf outfit, the kind that cost more than a working-class person's monthly rent. Her diamond earrings sparkled under the sun, but it was the sharpness in her eyes that stood out the most. She didn't just carry herself like someone important. She believed she was royalty. Celeste had been a member of Oakhaven for over 20 years. Her late husband had been one of its key benefactors, and though she didn't technically own the club, she acted as if she did. She knew everyone, influenced everything, and dictated who did and didn't belong. And today she had decided that Shaquille O'Neal didn't belong. She watched as he casually adjusted his glove, preparing to take his first shot at the driving range. The sight alone irritated her. She had seen celebrities before, actors, politicians, even tech billionaires. But Shaq? He wasn't the kind of wealth she respected. He was new money, a sports figure who, in her mind, had stumbled into fortune instead of being born into it. She marched toward him, heels clicking against the pavement. "Excuse me," she said, her voice honeyed but firm, the practiced politeness of someone used to delivering insults wrapped in pleasantries. "I think you might be lost." Shaq glanced at her, then at the club around him. "Pretty sure I'm right where I'm supposed to be." Celeste's smile was tight. "I don't think so. You see, this is a private club. Membership only. And from what I can tell..." She let her gaze travel up and down his attire, judgment dripping from every glance. "I don't believe you're on the list." Shaq suppressed a smirk. "Here we go. I checked in at the clubhouse," he said smoothly, refusing to take the bait. "Got my tea time set. All good." Celeste arched a brow. "Oh? And who exactly gave you that tea time?" Shaq shrugged, taking his time adjusting his grip on the club. "I don't remember his name. Nice guy, though." Celeste's expression darkened. The idea that some employee had dared to let this man onto her course without her knowledge made her blood boil. "I'll have to speak to management about that," she said coldly. "We have very high standards here, and not just anyone can—" "Celeste," a voice interrupted. She turned sharply to see Arthur Remington, a longtime member and one of the club's more reasonable figures, approaching. He was in his 60s, gray-haired but sharp, with the quiet authority of someone who actually earned his status instead of inheriting it. Arthur gave Shaq a nod of respect. "I assume you're here to play?" Shaq smiled. "That's the plan." Arthur's eyes flickered toward Celeste, sensing the tension. "Is there a problem?" Celeste folded her arms. "Arthur, this gentleman seems to think he has a tea time. I was just clarifying how exclusive Oakhaven is." Arthur sighed, already exasperated. "Celeste, do you know who this is?" She gave a thin, unimpressed smile. "Oh, I'm well aware. A basketball player, right?" Arthur's jaw tightened. "Not just a basketball player." Celeste tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Oh? Enlighten me." Arthur hesitated. He knew the truth, but he also knew Shaq hadn't revealed it yet. Instead of outing him, he simply said, "You should probably step back on this one." Celeste let out a mocking laugh. "Oh, Arthur, always so diplomatic, but the fact remains—" She turned back to Shaq, voice dripping with condescension. "This isn't some public course. It's not open to just anyone with a little money to throw around. It's about legacy, culture, and knowing one's place." Shaq met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "One's place, huh?" She didn't even flinch. "Exactly. It's nothing personal, of course. I'm sure you can find somewhere else to play." Shaq let the silence hang in the air, watching her, studying her. He had seen people like Celeste his whole life. People who thought their wealth gave them the right to dictate who was worthy. People who had never faced real struggle, who had never earned what they had. He smiled, slow and deliberate. "You know what's funny?" Celeste's expression stiffened. Shaq set his club down and dusted off his hands. "You're standing on my course, telling me I don't belong." The words hit like a hammer. Celeste blinked. "Excuse me?" Arthur sighed. "Celeste, he owns Oakhaven." The color drained from Celeste's face. The silence was deafening. A few nearby members froze in place, their whispers dying mid-sentence. Even the birds in the distance seemed to quiet as realization sank in. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "I was gonna let y'all keep guessing, but hey, you wanted to talk about who belongs." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a gold-plated membership card, one with his name engraved at the top. Celeste stared at it, her lips parting, but no words came out. Shaq looked around, then picked up his club again. "Now, if you don't mind, I got a game to play." He stepped past her, lining up for his swing. Celeste remained frozen in place, her entire world crumbling in real time. For the first time in her life, Celeste Montclair was speechless. A handful of club members had turned their attention to the brewing situation, their curiosity piqued by the sharp edge in her voice. Some whispered, others averted their eyes, but no one stepped in. No one ever challenged Celeste Montclair. Shaq, meanwhile, stood tall, his hands resting casually on his club, his expression unreadable. He had been in high-pressure situations his entire life, NBA championships, boardroom negotiations, media frenzies. But something about this moment, this woman, this entitled arrogance, amused him more than it angered him. "Do I need to repeat myself?" Celeste's voice was clipped, her impatience growing. "I asked you to leave. This is a private club, and we have very clear policies about membership." Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head with a small chuckle. "That so?" Celeste lifted her chin, mistaking his amusement for ignorance. "I don't know how you got in, but this isn't the kind of place you just walk into. I can't imagine why security let you through in the first place." One of her companions, Leslie Whitmore, a longtime friend and fellow socialite, shifted uncomfortably. She wasn't brave enough to oppose Celeste, but there was a nervous edge to her posture. "Celeste, maybe we should—" Celeste cut her off with a slight wave of her hand, never breaking eye contact with Shaq. "No, Leslie. This is exactly why Oakhaven has standards. Because if we start letting anyone in, we lose what makes this place special." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Anyone?" Celeste let out a small haughty laugh, as if the answer was obvious. "You know exactly what I mean." The tension thickened. A few younger members, newer to the club and less entrenched in its unspoken rules, exchanged uneasy glances. Others, the old guard, the ones who thrived in Celeste's world, smirked quietly, waiting to see how she would dismantle the man in front of her. Shaq remained unfazed. He leaned on his club, tilting his head slightly, his voice measured and easy. So, let me get this straight. I show up to play a little golf, mind my business, and that's a problem? Celeste's smile was razor sharp. It's not personal, but Oakhaven prides itself on its exclusivity. We have a very particular kind of clientele. Shaq nodded slowly, as if absorbing her words, before letting out another chuckle. Ah, and I don't fit that particular kind. Celeste tilted her head slightly. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. For the first time, Celeste faltered. It was the way he said it, not with anger, not with defensiveness, but with certainty. He had dealt with this before. Still, she refused to back down. This isn't about you specifically. It's about maintaining Oakhaven's integrity. Shaq whistled low. Integrity. He let the word hang in the air. That's a funny way to say exclusion. Her smile faltered for half a second before returning with full force. There's no need to be dramatic. But since you seem to be having trouble understanding the rules, let me make this easy for you. She snapped her fingers, turning toward a nearby staff member. Get security. Now. A ripple of discomfort moved through the onlookers. Leslie's eyes widened. Even a few of the older members shuffled uncomfortably. Celeste, Leslie whispered. Maybe we should just… Celeste shot her a look. Stay out of this, Leslie. Shaq let out a low laugh, shaking his head. You really calling security on me? Celeste lifted her chin, her confidence unshaken. I'm ensuring the rules are followed. If you don't belong here, you don't belong here. The words echoed in the silence. A young couple standing a few feet away shifted nervously. A caddy, pretending to clean golf clubs, stole a glance at Shaq, then at Celeste. No one spoke. But Shaq? He wasn't uncomfortable. He was calm, cool, patient. He had spent his life breaking barriers, on the court, in business, in philanthropy. He had walked into rooms where people thought he didn't belong, and every single time he had left those rooms proving that he did. So instead of reacting, instead of giving Celeste the confrontation she wanted, he did the one thing she couldn't stand. He smiled. A slow, deliberate, knowing smile. Celeste's fingers twitched at her sides. She had expected anger, maybe defensiveness, maybe even an apology. But this made her feel like she was the one losing control. Before she could say anything else, 2 security guards arrived. One of them, a tall, broad man named Eddie Coleman, immediately recognized Shaq. His eyes widened. Celeste crossed her arms. There he is. Escort this man off the premises. Eddie's jaw tightened. He glanced at Shaq, then at Celeste, then at the small crowd of members watching in silence. Ma'am, Eddie started cautiously. I think there's a misunderstanding. Celeste's eyes narrowed. What misunderstanding? I told you he doesn't belong here. Another voice cut through the tension, a firm, authoritative voice. Celeste, it said. That's enough. All heads turned toward Henry Calloway, the club manager, as he stepped forward, his expression carefully composed. A man in his early 60s, Henry had spent decades ensuring Oakhaven's reputation remained untarnished. He had cleaned up scandals, smoothed over disputes, and made sure trouble never lingered long enough to stain the club's name. And now, he was staring at the biggest mistake Celeste had ever made. Celeste straightened, regaining her confidence. Henry, thank God. Finally, someone with sense. Please inform this man that he's not allowed to just… Celeste, Henry interrupted, his voice carrying an edge. You need to stop talking. Celeste's mouth clamped shut. The crowd stilled. Henry took a slow breath, then turned toward Shaq with a tired but respectful nod. Mr. O'Neal, he said, I apologize for this inconvenience. Celeste blinked. Once, twice. Mr. O'Neal? Her stomach dropped. Shaq smiled, easy and unbothered. No problem, Henry. Celeste's mind raced. Why was Henry apologizing to him? Why was security hesitating? Her lips parted, realization creeping in. Wait, what is… Henry turned back to her, his voice dropping low and firm. Celeste, do you know who this is? She let out a nervous laugh. Of course I do. He owns Oakhaven. The words hit like a hammer. Celeste felt the blood drain from her face. Shaq adjusted his golf glove, his tone still light, amused. You were saying something about belonging? The silence was deafening. Celeste, for the first time in her life, had nothing to say. Every pair of eyes on the driving range was locked on Celeste Montclair, who stood with her arms crossed, her expression radiating confidence. The sheer audacity of the situation amused her. This man, whoever he was, refusing to leave a place he clearly didn't belong. She turned sharply to Henry Calloway, the club manager, her voice clipped and impatient. Henry, I assume you're not blind. This man is trespassing. Escort him out. Henry stood frozen, his fingers tightening slightly over the clipboard he held. Beads of sweat lined his brow, and his throat bobbed with a nervous swallow. He had handled countless high-profile disputes at Oakhaven over the years, but nothing like this. Celeste's smirk deepened when Henry didn't move. She saw his hesitation as weakness, as incompetence. With a scoff, she waved a dismissive hand. You're not seriously hesitating, are you? Do your job. Henry exhaled, his aging hands trembling slightly as he removed his glasses. He knew this was going to get messy. Very messy. A heavy pause stretched between them. Then, in a voice that carried across the stunned silence, Henry said, Ms. Montclair, this is Mr. O'Neal. He owns Oakhaven. For a moment, it seemed like time itself had stopped. The murmur of whispers rippled through the onlookers, their disbelief spreading like wildfire. A few gasps slipped out, but most people simply stared, wide-eyed, their minds struggling to process what they had just heard. Celeste blinked, then blinked again. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The words didn't make sense. She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. I'm sorry. What? Henry sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose before repeating, slower this time. Mr. O'Neal is the new owner of Oakhaven. Celeste felt the color drain from her face. Her perfectly composed demeanor cracked, just for a second before she quickly regathered herself. This had to be a mistake. There was no way this was true. This is some kind of joke, she scoffed, a nervous chuckle escaping her throat. She turned toward the surrounding members, expecting someone, anyone, to deny it. No one did. Instead, the expressions around her shifted. Some were amused, others were wide-eyed with shock. Even Leslie Whitmore, her closest friend, was staring at Shaq with something dangerously close to admiration. Celeste's hands curled into fists. No, she said, shaking her head. There's no way someone like... She caught herself mid-sentence, biting back the words before they slipped out. But Shaq already knew what she was going to say. He had seen it 1,000,000 times before. The unspoken line, the weight behind words that never needed to be completed. Someone like him. Still, he remained calm, cool, unbothered. He adjusted his golf glove, taking his sweet time before responding. You were saying... Celeste's nails dug into her palm. The way he said it? Smooth, deliberate, controlled. Infuriated her. She took a breath, forcing herself to regain control of the situation. Fine, she said, lifting her chin. Even if it's true, even if you somehow own this place, that doesn't change the fact that Oakhaven has a certain caliber of members. Shaq exhaled sharply through his nose, a ghost of a laugh passing his lips. That right? Celeste nodded, doubling down instead of backing off. This club isn't just about money, she said, each word carefully placed like a dagger. It's about heritage, tradition, class. You can own the walls, but you can't buy what makes Oakhaven. Oakhaven. The crowd stiffened. Even Henry, who had been trying to remain neutral, let out a tired sigh. Shaq gave a slow nod, as if he were letting the weight of her words settle. Then, with a small smirk, he turned slightly, addressing everyone instead of just Celeste. You know, I hear this kind of talk all the time, he said, his deep voice carrying effortlessly. People say money doesn't change who you really are. That's true in some ways. But you know what does? He let the question hang for a moment. Power. Celeste's eyes narrowed. Shaq shrugged, his tone easy. See, people don't change when they get money. They change when they get power. And when you're used to having all of it, the second you feel it slipping, you show who you really are. Celeste's jaw clenched. She had walked into this confrontation believing herself untouchable, but now the ground beneath her was crumbling, and she knew it. Still, she refused to let herself look weak. You can dress it up however you like, she said, voice tight. But some people don't belong in certain spaces. It's just the way things are. The crowd tensed. Shaq nodded slowly, as if considering her words. Then he said, "You're right." Celeste's smirk returned, until he added, "And that's why you don't belong here anymore." Her face drained of all color. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The weight of what he had just implied hit her like a freight train. The crowd murmured, shifting uneasily. Even those who silently agreed with Celeste's views couldn't deny what was happening. Shaq didn't need to raise his voice or throw insults. He had done the one thing Celeste never expected. He dismissed her, completely. She had been expecting a fight, an argument, an explosion of anger. Instead, she had been shrugged off like an irrelevant footnote. And that stung more than any public humiliation ever could. She took a shaky breath, plastering on a brittle smile. "Well," she said, straightening her posture, "I suppose I'll be having a talk with the board about this." Shaq tilted his head. "You do that." Celeste let out a forced laugh, then turned sharply on her heel, walking away with calculated grace. Leslie hesitated for a split second before following her, but the look on her face said she wasn't sure if she wanted to be associated with Celeste anymore. The crowd slowly began to disperse, whispering amongst themselves. Shaq, now finally left with his piece, turned back to the driving range, adjusting his stance. As he lined up for his next swing, Henry Calloway cleared his throat. "Mr. O'Neal," he said quietly, "I apologize for all of that." Shaq didn't look away from his shot. "Not your fault." Henry hesitated. "Still, if you need me to, I can arrange a formal—" Shaq swung. The golf ball soared across the range, disappearing into the clear blue sky. Only then did he glance at Henry. "We good?" Henry blinked, then quickly nodded. "Yes, sir. We're good." Shaq gave a small smile, then turned back to his game. Because for him, this was already over. For Celeste, it was only the beginning. What had begun as a public confrontation between Celeste Montclair and Shaquille O'Neal had now transformed into the most talked-about incident in the club's history. Members whispered about it over cocktails at the bar. Caddies exchanged glances as they cleaned clubs, repeating what they had overheard. Even the staff, trained to remain neutral in all matters concerning the club's elite, couldn't help but exchange knowing looks. Some members found the entire situation amusing. A woman like Celeste, so used to controlling everything, had finally been put in her place. The way her smugness had evaporated the moment she learned Shaq owned the club was a story people couldn't stop telling. Others, however, weren't laughing. A particular faction of Oakhaven's old guard members shared Celeste's mindset, even if they weren't foolish enough to say it outright. They had spent generations building this club into a fortress of exclusivity, and now it was slipping from their grasp. And no one hated that reality more than Celeste Montclair. That afternoon, Celeste disappeared from public view, retreating to the shadows of the club's most exclusive private lounge. It was a dimly lit, oak-paneled sanctuary where the true power players of Oakhaven gathered, the ones who still clung to the belief that money and lineage dictated who belonged and who didn't. She sat at a round table, surrounded by her most loyal circle. 4 men and 2 women, all of them longtime members. All of them from families that had been part of Oakhaven for generations. Their expressions were carefully neutral, but their body language revealed the tension hanging in the air. Celeste, however, was composed. If there was one thing she refused to be, it was a sore loser. She would not lick her wounds. She would strike back. She exhaled slowly, swirling the ice in her whiskey glass before finally speaking. "Oakhaven has always stood for tradition," she said, her voice smooth and unwavering. "For values, for excellence. And today we watched it get trampled." Across from her, Gregory Langston, a real estate mogul in his 60s, leaned back in his chair. "You embarrassed yourself, Celeste," he said bluntly. You picked the wrong fight. Celeste's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. Did I? She raised a brow, challenging him. Or did I expose exactly what's happening to this club? A murmur passed through the group. Look around you, Celeste continued, her gaze sweeping the table. This place is changing, and not in a way that benefits people like us. Oakhaven isn't just a golf course, it's a legacy. Our legacy. But suddenly, someone who doesn't understand what this place stands for is sitting at the top, deciding what happens next. Isabel Ashford, an elegant woman in her 70s who had been raised in wealth, tapped a manicured nail against the table. We can't just let it happen, she murmured. Celeste leaned forward. Exactly. If we do nothing in a year, this place will be overrun with outsiders who don't respect its history. She set her glass down sharply. Shaquille O'Neal isn't just a new owner. He's a symbol of what happens when tradition is ignored. And I, for one, refuse to let this club become unrecognizable. The room fell into deep, thoughtful silence. Gregory finally exhaled, rubbing his jaw. So what exactly do you propose? Celeste's lips curled into a slow, calculated smile. We remind him that Oakhaven is bigger than any one man, even its owner. While Celeste was busy conspiring in the shadows, the world outside of Oakhaven had begun to take notice. Rachel Lawson, an ambitious young journalist at the Daily Post, had been scrolling through her social media feed that evening when she stumbled upon a shaky, secretly recorded video of Celeste's confrontation with Shaq. The clip was grainy, but it captured everything. The way Celeste demanded that Shaq leave, the way she smirked as she spoke about certain people not belonging, and the moment her entire world shattered when she realized who he was. Rachel watched it twice, her journalist instincts kicking in immediately. She knew a good story when she saw one. Rachel grabbed her notepad, pulled up her laptop, and started researching. She didn't just want to cover the incident. She wanted to know everything about Oakhaven Golf Club. It didn't take long for her to uncover Oakhaven's history of exclusivity, its long-standing tradition of rejecting certain types of members. There were no official records of discrimination, of course. The club was too smart for that, but the patterns were clear. And now, Shaquille O'Neal had unknowingly walked into a battleground. Rachel smiled to herself as she picked up her phone. Hey Mark, she said when her editor picked up. I think I've got something big. Back at Oakhaven, Celeste was already making her next move. The first step? Controlling the narrative. Before morning, she had already reached out to a few trusted journalists, ones who catered to the old money elite, ones who would spin the story in her favor. By the time Oakhaven's members woke up the next day, a new version of the story had already begun circulating. According to Celeste's narrative, she had simply been enforcing club rules when she asked Shaq to leave. Shaq had overreacted, using his celebrity status to humiliate a loyal member. The real story wasn't about racism. It was about traditional values being erased by money and power. And to Celeste's satisfaction, some people believed it. While the club buzzed with new debates, Shaq remained quiet. He had no interest in playing Celeste's game. He had seen people like her before, their need for control, their fear of losing power. But he also knew that silence could be just as powerful as words. So, while Celeste schemed and Rachel Lawson dug deeper, Shaq did what he always did. He let them talk. Because soon enough the truth would speak for itself. It started as a quiet ripple, a single post buried among thousands of others. A bystander at Oakhaven Golf Club had managed to capture the confrontation between Celeste Montclair and Shaquille O'Neal on their phone. At first, the video wasn't much. A shaky clip, muffled audio, background chatter. But then, someone cleaned up the sound, adjusted the brightness, and re-uploaded it with captions. And that's when it caught fire. By noon the next day, the video had gone viral. The clip showed everything. Celeste's smug condescension, the way she demanded that Shaq leave, the sheer confidence in her belief that he didn't belong. Then, the moment of her downfall, the instant Henry Callaway revealed that Shaq owned the club. The internet ate it up. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook exploded with commentary. Every second, new posts emerged dissecting every frame, every line, every micro-expression. Some of the most liked comments read, "Rich old money lady tries to kick out a literal billionaire. The irony is killing me. She was so sure of herself, then boom, her whole world shattered in 5 seconds. This is exactly why people hate elitism. It's never about money. It's about power. Memes surfaced within hours. One of the most popular ones showed a screenshot of Celeste's smug face right before Henry's reveal, with the caption, "When you think you own the place, but the actual owner is standing right there." The clip was stitched, remixed, and analyzed. Podcasters debated it. Influencers weighed in. Late-night talk show hosts made jokes at Celeste's expense. It was no longer just a club dispute. It had become a cultural moment. But not everyone was against Celeste. Her inner circle of old money loyalists quickly rushed to her defense, spinning the incident as an overreaction by social media and the press. Some club members, both inside and outside of Oakhaven, claimed that Celeste was simply protecting the club's standards. The narrative shifted in some circles. She wasn't racist, she was just enforcing club rules. Shaq doesn't even belong there. He's a temporary investor, not a real member. He used his celebrity status to intimidate her. Right-wing media outlets picked up the story, framing it as an example of cancel culture attacking traditional values. Conservative pundits debated whether private spaces should be forced to accept just anyone. Meanwhile, progressive voices clapped back hard, calling out elitism, racism, and entitlement. The hashtag #Let Shaq Play trended for 2 days straight. The pressure on Celeste was crushing. She wasn't used to being the villain. She was always the one in control, the one pulling the strings. Now she was being dragged through the mud, mocked on national television, and painted as a symbol of outdated privilege. It was unbearable. So she did what anyone in her position would do. She called in favors. Celeste had spent years cultivating relationships in the media, and now she cashed in on them. Within 24 hours, articles started appearing on select news sites, ones with a history of favoring the elite. The new narrative? She had been misunderstood. She was simply trying to uphold club policies when Shaq arrived. She felt threatened and intimidated by his presence. He had used his fame to turn the situation against her. A headline from a wealthy lifestyle magazine read, "Shaquille O'Neal versus Oakhaven." Was this a setup? The piece painted Celeste as a concerned member, trying to protect the sanctity of her club when she was suddenly ambushed by a media storm. Another article claimed that Shaq wasn't actually the real owner, just a temporary investor. "This was never about race," Celeste said in an exclusive interview with a friendly news anchor. "It was about upholding the traditions of Oakhaven. I was enforcing the same standards we've always had." The anchor nodded sympathetically. "And now you're being villainized for it." Celeste gave a well-practiced sigh. Exactly. Her strategy was simple. Play the victim. Turn the attention away from her actions and onto the unfair backlash. Plant just enough doubt about Shaq's true ownership of Oakhaven. And for a brief moment, it seemed to be working. Until Shaq did the one thing she never expected. While the media frenzy raged on, Shaq didn't say a word. No statements, no press conferences, no interviews, just silence. And that silence drove Celeste crazy. She had expected a fight, expected him to defend himself, to push back. She had been prepared to spin every response he gave into further proof of his aggression. But he gave her nothing. Instead, he went about his usual business. He attended charity events, he visited local schools, he focused on his philanthropy work. And that, more than anything, made Celeste look worse. Because while she was on television crying about being unfairly targeted, Shaq was out there feeding families, helping underprivileged kids, and donating millions to causes bigger than golf. The contrast was brutal. And slowly, people began seeing through Celeste's act. A week after the incident, a well-respected journalist published an in-depth exposé titled, "The Truth About Oakhaven: What the Celeste Montclair Scandal Really Reveals." The article didn't just break down the viral video. It dug into Oakhaven's long history of exclusivity, the quiet rejection of minority members, and the club's unspoken policies of keeping outsiders out. It exposed Celeste's connections to powerful figures who had maintained that system for decades. And it proved, without a doubt, that Shaq was the full legal owner of Oakhaven. The piece went viral overnight. Suddenly, the same media outlets that had defended Celeste began distancing themselves from her. Public sentiment shifted hard. Now, she wasn't just a woman who had tried to kick Shaq out of his own club. She was a symbol of everything wrong with the old elite. Her inner circle started shrinking. Some of her closest allies stopped returning her calls. Luxury brands quietly pulled sponsorships from the charities she supported. Even Oakhaven's board members, the same ones who once agreed with her, began whispering about whether her presence was becoming a liability. And worst of all, she knew this wasn't over. Because if there was one thing the internet never did, it was forget. Rachel Lawson sat at her desk, the dim glow of her laptop screen illuminating the stacks of notes and newspaper clippings spread across her workspace. She had spent the past 48 hours deep in research, digging through everything she could find on Oakhaven Golf Club. And what she had uncovered was far worse than she expected. At first, it was just whispers from old newspaper archives, mentions of exclusive membership policies and legacy-based admissions. Carefully worded phrases designed to hide the truth. But the deeper she looked, the clearer it became. For decades, Oakhaven had been a fortress of exclusion. It wasn't just about wealth. It wasn't just about status. It was about who was allowed in and who was deliberately kept out. Rachel's fingers trembled slightly as she flipped through an old club registry from the 1960s. The names on the list were exactly what she expected. The same last names repeated generation after generation. A dynasty of power. Nowhere on the list was a single black member. Not one. Not in the 60s. Not in the 70s. Not even in the early 80s. And then, buried in a 1984 lawsuit she had uncovered, she found something chilling. A rejected membership application. The name on it? James Carter. Rachel's stomach twisted as she read through the legal complaint Carter had filed. Carter was a successful black businessman, a real estate mogul who had amassed significant wealth and had, at the time, been one of the most prominent entrepreneurs in the state. His money was good enough for Oakhaven. His skin wasn't. The lawsuit claimed that despite Carter meeting every financial and character requirement, the club had rejected his membership without cause. When he pressed for an explanation, he was told there were no openings. But Rachel had found membership records proving otherwise. That year, 5 other men had been admitted, all of them white. All of them with less impressive resumes than Carter. The case had never made it to trial. Oakhaven had settled quietly behind closed doors, paying Carter off in exchange for his silence. Rachel's heart pounded. This wasn't just some old money snobbery. This was systematic, deliberate exclusion. Rachel kept digging, chasing every lead, every name, every document. Then she found it. A contract from 1952, signed by Oakhaven's founding members. The wording was carefully crafted, avoiding direct discrimination while still cementing Oakhaven as a whites-only club. The key section read, "Membership shall be extended to individuals of established community standing, emphasizing generational presence and historical contributions to Oakhaven's mission of traditional excellence." Translation? If your family hadn't already been part of Oakhaven, you were never getting in. And who had been barred from membership for generations? Black families, self-made entrepreneurs, new wealth. Rachel leaned back in her chair, stunned. This wasn't a fluke. It was the foundation of the club itself. Rachel didn't waste time. By the next morning, she had pieced together her explosive exposé and hit publish. The headline? Oakhaven's History of Exclusion. Has anything really changed? The article was brutal, exposing the history of silent segregation in Oakhaven's membership, the 1984 lawsuit and how the club paid to bury it, the 1952 founding document proving deliberate exclusion. And then, she tied it back to the present. The Celeste Montclair scandal wasn't just one incident. It was proof that Oakhaven's old values still thrived. The backlash against Shaq wasn't about him changing the club. It was about him being the first person powerful enough to break their system. Rachel's article spread like wildfire. News outlets picked it up. Journalists started asking questions. The conversation shifted from, was Celeste wrong? To, has Oakhaven always been broken? By the afternoon, the club was trending nationwide. The fallout was immediate. Oakhaven wasn't just a private golf club, it was a brand. And brands had sponsors. Several luxury corporations, high-end car companies, and banking institutions had long-standing partnerships with Oakhaven. It was good PR. Being associated with an elite club signaled prestige. But now, that prestige had turned into a scandal. Rachel's article forced these companies into an impossible position. Continue supporting Oakhaven? They'd be endorsing an institution built on exclusion. Cut ties? They'd be admitting that they had turned a blind eye to its past. Within hours, 2 major corporate sponsors announced they were reviewing their association with Oakhaven. By nightfall, a 3rd sponsor pulled out completely. The club was bleeding money. And no one felt the panic more than Celeste Montclair. Celeste sat in the dim glow of her private lounge, her perfectly controlled world slipping through her fingers. She had spent years shaping Oakhaven's reputation, curating its image, keeping its legacy pure. And now, one article, one scandal, one man, and it was all crumbling. She needed a scapegoat, someone to take the fall so she could distance herself, and she knew exactly who that person would be. The next morning, Celeste called an emergency meeting with Oakhaven's board members. When Henry Calloway arrived, he immediately sensed the tension in the air. The way the board members shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze. The way Celeste sat at the head of the table, her expression unreadable. Then, she spoke. "It's come to our attention," she began smoothly, "that the club's reputation has been compromised." Henry's gut tightened. Celeste continued, her tone practiced and poised. "Given the recent media frenzy, it's clear that certain individuals have mishandled Oakhaven's traditions." She folded her hands on the table. "And unfortunately, that means changes must be made." Henry's breath hitched. He knew where this was going. "You're blaming me." His voice was flat. Celeste gave a sympathetic smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "Henry, the club needs a fresh start, and right now, we need to show the public that we're taking accountability." His stomach churned. He had served this club for decades, protected it, cleaned up its messes. And now, he was the mess being cleaned up. Celeste sighed dramatically. "We think it would be best if you stepped down." Silence. Henry's hands curled into fists under the table. He looked around. Not one board member spoke up for him. Cowards. This wasn't about reputation. This was self-preservation. He let out a slow breath, standing up. His voice was steady, but his eyes were sharp. "You think throwing me out is gonna fix this?" He shook his head. "You have no idea what's coming." Celeste's smile tightened. Henry gave her one last look before turning and walking out the door. Celeste exhaled in relief. She had dodged a bullet. Or so she thought. Because the storm. Celeste Montclair sat in the dim glow of her lavish study, staring at the headlines flashing across her laptop screen. Everywhere she looked, her name was synonymous with disgrace. The fallout from Rachel Lawson's exposé had been devastating. Oakhaven's history of exclusion, the leaked documents, and the sponsorship withdrawals had turned a quiet, exclusive golf club into the center of a national scandal. She had spent years crafting an untouchable image. Now, she was a joke. Her phone calls went unanswered. The same people who used to beg for her attention now pretended they had never known her. Even Leslie Whitmore, her so-called closest friend, was keeping her distance. Celeste clenched her jaw, fury rising in her chest. She wouldn't let them do this to her. She wouldn't be humiliated. She wouldn't be silenced. If Shaq and Rachel wanted a war, they were going to get one. That night, Celeste placed a single call, one that could shift the power back into her hands. Her contact? Duncan Hargrove, a ruthless, high-profile attorney known for taking on impossible cases, if the price was right. He had represented politicians, CEOs, and even celebrities caught in the worst kinds of scandals. His specialty? Flipping the narrative. Celeste met him the next morning at his private law office, her face carefully composed despite the storm raging inside her. "Tell me what I can do," she said, sitting across from him in his sleek office, its walls lined with framed newspaper clippings of his past legal victories. Duncan steepled his fingers, eyeing her with the curiosity of a man deciding whether she was worth the trouble. "You want to sue for defamation," he said finally, "against Shaquille O'Neal and Rachel Lawson." Celeste nodded. "They've ruined my reputation, turned me into a public spectacle. I want to make them pay." Duncan leaned back in his chair, considering her. "You have money, but you don't have a case." Celeste's lip curled. "That's why I came to you. To create one." He smirked. "Now you're speaking my language." Within 24 hours, Duncan Hargrove filed a $20 million defamation lawsuit against both Shaquille O'Neal and Rachel Lawson. The claims were as absurd as they were desperate. Celeste had been slandered and misrepresented in Rachel's article. Shaq had orchestrated a personal attack against her by remaining silent while the internet dragged her name. The baseless rumors about Oakhaven's past had led to emotional distress and financial damages. Her goal wasn't to win. Her goal was to intimidate. If she could bury Rachel in legal fees and pressure Shaq into settling quietly, she could regain control of the story. Celeste sat back, satisfied as the media caught fire once again, only this time with her framing the story. But what Celeste hadn't expected? The world had already turned against her. By the afternoon, legal analysts were tearing the lawsuit apart on national television. "This is textbook intimidation," said Lawrence Gibbons, a well-known attorney who appeared on a popular news segment. "Celeste Montclair has no real case. She's just trying to silence people who expose the truth." Social media exploded again. But instead of giving Celeste sympathy, it mocked her even harder. "She's suing a billionaire who didn't even talk about her. That's a new level of pathetic. She really thinks Shaq is going to be scared? Sis, he's fought bigger opponents on the court. Rachel Lawson is about to become even more famous after this case gets thrown out." Late-night talk show hosts joined in, with one joking. "If defamation means showing the world who you really are, Celeste Montclair has a solid case against herself." Shaq's silence, and his secret move. While Celeste's desperation played out on every news cycle, Shaq remained as silent as ever. No press conferences, no interviews, no legal response. Nothing. And that silence terrified her. What was he waiting for? What Celeste didn't know was that while she was wasting her energy on lawsuits and media spins, Shaq had been working behind the scenes. He had no intention of fighting her publicly. Instead, he was preparing to dismantle her entire world. For weeks, he had been meeting with the board members of Oakhaven. While some of them had been hesitant at first, the sponsorship withdrawals and negative press had changed everything. Suddenly, Celeste wasn't an asset. She was a liability. And now, Shaq was ready to make his move. As Celeste watched the lawsuit crumble in real time, she had no idea that the real battle was already over. At the head of the massive oak table, Shaquille O'Neal sat calm and composed, his large hands folded as he listened to the rising tension in the room. Across from him, Celeste Montclair was anything but calm. Her expression was tight, her lips pressed into a thin line as she surveyed the faces around her. Some were loyal to her, others had begun to shift away. The fallout from the scandal, the lawsuit's humiliating failure, and the exodus of sponsors had rattled even her closest allies. And now, she was losing her grip on everything. "Gentlemen, ladies," Arthur Remington, one of the oldest board members, cleared his throat, silencing the murmurs. "Let's not waste time. We are here to discuss the future of Oakhaven." His sharp gaze swept the room. "And we cannot ignore the predicament we now find ourselves in." Predicament. Celeste nearly scoffed at the word. Oakhaven wasn't in a predicament. It was in a crisis. And it was all Shaquille O'Neal's fault. She sat forward, her voice sharp. "Arthur, there's no need for a drawn-out discussion. We all know what the problem is. This club has been dragged through the mud because certain individuals don't understand its legacy." A few of the older board members nodded in agreement, but there were fewer of them than before. Shaq remained silent, watching her with an unreadable expression. Celeste exhaled and continued, her tone shifting to something more desperate, more pleading. "For decades, Oakhaven has stood as a beacon of tradition, excellence, and exclusivity. We have thrived by maintaining high standards, by being selective about who we allow into our world. That is not discrimination. It is preservation. A low murmur spread through the room. Some agreed. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Shaq finally leaned forward, his deep voice cutting through the noise. You call it preservation. He paused. I call it a club that's on the verge of falling apart. The silence was instant. Shaq glanced around the table, meeting the eyes of every single board member before continuing. Let's be real, he said smoothly. Oak Haven is drowning. Sponsors are pulling out. Membership is declining, and the press, they won't let this go. He gestured toward a stack of newspapers on the table, each with headlines condemning Oak Haven's exclusivity. If we keep going down this road, this club won't be a symbol of excellence. He leaned back. It'll be a cautionary tale. Celeste shook her head, furious. That's a scare tactic. Shaq's eyes flicked toward her, but he didn't respond. Instead, he pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. Here's what I propose. Arthur picked up the folder, flipping through it. His eyebrows raised slightly. Shaq continued, his voice steady. Oak Haven needs to evolve. We need to open our doors, to families, to younger professionals, to people who love golf but have never been given the chance to play here. Celeste let out a sharp laugh. You want to turn Oak Haven into a public park? Shaq smirked. Not quite. He nodded toward Arthur. Take a look at the financial projections. Arthur cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he read. Shaquille's proposal includes a complete modernization of Oak Haven's facilities, expanding the clubhouse, adding a world-class golf academy, and restructuring the membership model to attract corporate sponsors and younger members. Celeste's stomach twisted. Shaq wasn't just talking about inclusion. He was talking about money. And that was something the board couldn't ignore. I know some of y'all are scared of change, Shaq continued. I get it. But tell me, what's more important? Holding on to the past, or keeping this place alive for the future? The board members looked at one another. Some were still on the fence, weighing their loyalty to Celeste against the reality of the situation. Celeste could see it happening, could feel control slipping through her fingers. No, she snapped. This is ridiculous. You think you can just waltz in here and rewrite history? Shaq's smile didn't waver. History gets rewritten every day. The words hung in the air. Celeste's chest tightened. She had spent years ensuring people like Shaquille O'Neal never had a voice in places like this. And now, he was writing the rules. Arthur set down the folder. He looked up, expression serious. I won't lie, he said slowly. I've been a member of this club for 40 years. I've seen traditions hold us together, and I've seen them hold us back. He exhaled. I think it's time we move forward. Celeste's fingers dug into her chair. Then, one by one, other board members nodded. I support the proposal. It's a smart move. We have to adapt. Each voice was another dagger to Celeste's pride. Finally, Arthur turned to her. Celeste? Her jaw was clenched so tight she thought she might break a tooth. She had lost, but she would never admit it. With a cold glare, she rose from her seat. You've destroyed Oak Haven, she spat at Shaq, voice dripping with venom. Shaq just smiled. Nah, I just saved it. Celeste's heels clicked sharply against the floor as she stormed out of the boardroom. She didn't look back, because she knew that if she did, she would see the world she had built collapsing behind her. The morning sun stretched across the revitalized greens of Oak Haven Golf Club, casting a golden glow over a sight no one could have imagined just months ago. The gates that once symbolized exclusivity and silent rejection now stood open, welcoming a new kind of crowd. The energy was electric. Families, young athletes, and golf enthusiasts from every background filled the course. The once hushed clubhouse now buzzed with life, the walls adorned with new photographs, not just of past Oak Haven champions, but of barrier-breaking golfers who had once been denied entry. And at the heart of it all, Shaquille O'Neal stood tall, watching it unfold with quiet satisfaction. Oak Haven's first major event under Shaq's leadership wasn't a high society tournament. It wasn't a closed-off gathering for the old elite. It was a charity golf tournament, designed for a purpose bigger than the game itself. The participants? Underprivileged kids who had never set foot on a golf course before. For many of them, golf had always seemed like a sport reserved for the wealthy, something played behind locked gates on pristine lawns they were never meant to walk on. Today, that changed. Shaq watched the kids in their new golf uniforms, excitement radiating from them as they picked up their clubs for the first time. Volunteers and professional golfers, many of whom had been personally invited by Shaq, mentored them, teaching them the fundamentals with patience and encouragement. The crowd erupted into cheers when a young girl, no older than 10, made her first clean swing, sending the ball soaring. She jumped with joy, turning to Shaq with wide eyes. "Did you see that?" she beamed. Shaq grinned. "I sure did. You got a better swing than me already." She giggled, gripping the club with renewed confidence. This was what change looked like. Later that afternoon, the attendees gathered at the clubhouse for a special unveiling. A velvet cloth covered a newly installed plaque near the clubhouse entrance. Shaq stood beside it, microphone in hand, his deep voice carrying across the crowd. "Oakhaven has a long history," he began. "Some of it we can be proud of. Some of it we can't." There was no need to elaborate. Everyone knew what had happened here, what this place had once represented. "But history doesn't have to define us," Shaq continued. "We get to decide what kind of place Oakhaven will be for the next generation. And today, we start with this." With that, he pulled back the cloth, revealing the newly renamed section of the club, the Charles Bennett Training Facility. A murmur of recognition passed through the crowd. Charles Bennett had been one of the most talented African-American golfers of his time. In the 1950s, he had been on the verge of competing at the national level, but he had been barred from clubs like Oakhaven. He had died never having played here. Until now. The crowd applauded, some even tearing up, as Shaq continued. This club once shut Charles out. But today, his name will be permanently etched into Oakhaven's future. Every young golfer who trains here will know his name, and they'll know that no matter where they come from, this sport belongs to them too. Among the many faces in the crowd, Rachel Lawson stood quietly, taking in the moment. She had come here not as a journalist chasing a scandal, but as someone who had, in her own way, helped spark this change. Since publishing her exposé on Oakhaven's history, her career had skyrocketed. She had been invited onto major news shows, won an investigative journalism award, and had been offered jobs at national publications. But today, she wasn't here as a reporter. She was here as a witness to something bigger than any headline. Shaq caught her eye from across the crowd and gave her a small nod of respect. She nodded back, feeling a rare moment of true fulfillment. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Shaq found himself standing at the 18th hole, watching a group of young golfers take their final swings of the day. A boy, about 12, lined up for a shot. His stance was stiff, his hands gripping the club with uncertainty. Shaq walked over, crouching beside him. "Relax your shoulders," Shaq said, adjusting the boy's grip. "Golf's all about rhythm. Let it flow." The boy took a breath, swung, and sent the ball soaring down the fairway. His face lit up. Shaq laughed. "See? Told you." The boy turned to him, eyes full of admiration. "I didn't think people like me could play here." Shaq knelt down to meet his gaze. "You belong anywhere you want to be." The boy smiled. And with that, a new legacy was born. Not just for Oakhaven Golf Club, but for every space that once shut people out. Change had come, and this time, it wasn't going anywhere. Change starts with a single swing. Oakhaven's transformation is just the beginning. What spaces still need to be opened? Join the conversation, share this story, and be part of the movement for equity, inclusion, and a future where everyone belongs. Subscribe, engage, and keep the momentum going, because the game is far from over.